Hello, this is King Rex coming at you with a presidential March Madness bracket. I thought this would be kind of fun. The actual um, ranking seating here is done using four recent polls that were done by academics. The 2021 C-SPAN poll, um, which I have a few of them pulled up here. It's the 2021 C-SPAN, which isn't listed here. The Siena from 2018. The APSA from 2018 and the USPC from 2016. APSA means American Political Science Association, and USPC is a UK survey. That is the polls that I'm using for the seating, but the choices I make will be my choices based on who I feel is the better president out of the two. And we'll give some of my reasoning behind it. I'll just use the fill here. Hopefully it goes in red. I'm just going to go straight down. First one is Chester Arthur versus Zachary Taylor. I think they both were good, solid presidents. I think Arthur was the better of the two. He did build the first steel ships for the Navy. He got the Pendleton Civil Service Act passed, which was no small feat because it really people who benefited from the spoil system were the politicians that had to get rid of it. Taylor was solid, but he just didn't really serve long enough to do too much of note. So maybe if he would have lived, he would have been higher, but he's kind of does loses out to Arthur for that reason. The next one is Ford and Buchanan. To me, this one's pretty easy slam dunk for Gerald Ford. He helped heal the country after Watergate. He actually did some things that got the economy back on track. The economy the first 2 years under Carter was good, mainly because of things Ford did. Um, Buchanan was just awful. I mean, even if states had started succeeding from the Union, when he first entered when he was leaving office, he still was just awful. Hayes and Fillmore, this is another, I think, are two pretty solid presidents. I give the nod here to Fillmore. Twice when Fillmore was president, there was potential open rebellions. Once when Texas was going to take over the part of New Mexico that's east of the Rio Grande River. And after that, it was South Carolina was actually um, preparing to secede from the Union, and he moved troops into position to stop them from seceding. So he did very well in both of those cases. So Fillmore gets the nod here. Next one is Nixon and Harding. I think Nixon's better than most people give him credit for, but I am going to go with Harding on this one. Harding was actually a really good president. He's basically unfairly smeared by his enemies, but he fixed a really bad economy, got peace treaties signed with the Central Powers. He had the Washington Naval Conference, which was the first arms reduction treaty ever. Basically set up the Roaring Twenties. Was one of the last presidents, one of the last two presidents, to run an actual net surplus during his term. The other was Coolidge, was his vice president that pretty much just followed his policies. Next, we have Harrison and Hoover. This is Benjamin Harrison because I'm only doing 40 presidents. I'm doing through George W. Bush. That way 40 makes a pretty nice bracket. I'm not doing William Henry Harrison and James Garfield and no one from Obama on. I might get rid of a lot of the political talk. Plus, some of those presidents just didn't serve long enough to really even rank. Here I'm going with Harrison. Hoover wasn't a bad president, but he failed miserably on the economy. Harrison was actually pretty good. He signed the Land Revision Act, which led to a lot of conservation of lands. He signed the Judicial Act, which put the Court of Appeals, it's right below the Supreme Court, in place. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, gave pensions to disabled veterans, which was actually something that people were against, which is kind of odd. Was just an all-around good, solid president, fought for the rights of African Americans in the South. All right, next one's Van Buren and Andrew Johnson. This one's actually pretty close. I think both of these presidents are pretty awful. But basically, Van Buren was bad in human rights, he was bad economically, and he was bad in foreign policy. Andrew Johnson was at least good in foreign policy and decent in economics. The Panic of 1837 happened under Van Buren, and he made things worse. He was the first pro-slavery Northern president. The first pro-slavery president was Andrew Jackson. He followed the same policies. He also had the Trail of Tears underneath him as well. Van Buren's pretty awful. Next, we have Tyler and George W. Bush. I'm going to go with Tyler here. Tyler did annex Texas, which was good for the country. He got the Webster-Ashburton Treaty signed, which settled a lot of disputes that were left over from Van Buren that Van Buren really didn't take care of. He pretty much extended the Monroe Doctrine over to Hawaii, and he got a trade treaties with China, which was opening of China was a big thing. He ended the Second Seminole War simply by just pulling out of it. I don't think Bush is as bad as most people say he is, but Tyler's a pretty solid president. Next, we have Coolidge and Pierce. This one's a pretty big slam dunk here. Coolidge was a very good president, kept the economy good, peace and prosperity during his time. The last president to run a net surplus during his term in office. Pierce did run a surplus during his term in office, but he destroyed his presidency by signing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So that means really these are all supposed to be pretty close, but Coolidge Pierce was a slam dunk and Ford Buchanan was a slam dunk. The others were all some level of closeness to him. Now we're going to go straight down these ones. Arthur comes back and faces Lincoln. As good as Arthur was, this is pretty much a slam dunk. Lincoln won the Civil War, which saved the Union, and he freed the slaves. Take quite a bit to beat that. Jackson and Polk was that. This is actually a very interesting matchup here. There's a few pretty interesting ones. This is one of them. And once again, the seeding was not done by me. It was 100% done by just how they ranked. And this is how this one falls out. Polk was pretty much Jackson's protege. While Polk was worlds better than Jackson, he did start a war of aggression against Mexico, get a large amount of territory. But that territory did benefit the United States in the end, and he did finally negotiate a boundary between the United States and Canada in the area called the Oregon Country, which is Washington State and British Columbia. So Polk was at least decent. Jackson was just terrible. I think Jackson's one of the worst presidents ever. So obviously, I'm going to go with Polk here. This is another interesting one because Reagan replaced Carter in office. I think there's too many that are that way where it's like, glad to replace the guy. Easily Reagan here. Reagan won the Cold War and he fixed the economy that Carter basically destroyed during his term by following bad economic policies. Carter also backed the group that became the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the Ayatollahs were in charge of Iran. So really this one's not even close. Here, this is going to go to Ford. I think Wilson's the worst president ever. He shouldn't have gotten into World War I. He did a lot of adventurism in Latin America that was bad for the country. He left the economy in a shambles. He was a very racist president. He imposed segregation in the federal government. The Palmer-Rays were underneath him. He opposed women's suffrage. He's just really bad. Here's one that's probably going to surprise a lot of people because I'm going to go with Fillmore. I might have spelled his name wrong. I can check real quick here. Just to find, no, there's two L's in it. Teddy Roosevelt's very overrated. He was a great speaker. He was a very interesting person, but he really didn't do a whole lot as president. And most of the things he did do in an unconstitutional manner. Like I said, Fillmore twice staved off Civil War, and the Compromise of 1850 did settle the slavery issue until it was reopened by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and you can't blame Kansas-Nebraska on Fillmore. He also opened Japan to trade, and he kept France from taking Hawaii. So that's a couple more good things he did. We've got George H.W. Bush and Monroe. This is a very close one. This would have been interesting if it would have been, because they're side by side, but they don't go against each other, Madison and Monroe. But George H.W. Bush was very masterful in overseeing the end of the Cold War. He actually did, I'm just going to put Bush here, not to put the H.W. He actually did help get the economy built back because the economy had actually recovered before he left office. So Monroe was a pretty good, solid president too, and he did have the Monroe Doctrine. These two are pretty close to my rankings, but I think just the way he handled the end of the Cold War, the coalition building against Iraq, um, handled China and Tiananmen Square. I think he did a really good job there. He was really the right man at the right time. This is another one that's close in my mind, but I think Grant, with what he did to did everything he really could to help the formerly freed slaves. He actually did completely crush out the Klan. It came back to life under Wilson because Wilson screened a very pro-Klan movie called For the Birth of a Nation. He gave it a glowing review, and he was actually quoted in it. These two are both top 10 presidents in my rankings too, Madison and Grant. Um, Grant slightly edges him out. Madison was right to do the War of 1812. So Madison technically probably should go further. He would beat some of these other people that are ahead of him. It's just he drew a bad seat against Grant. Another one will probably surprise a whole lot of people. I put Harding above Jefferson. Jefferson did have some great things in the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition and the first Barbary Pirates War, but the Embargo Act was terrible. He also attacked the judiciary by trying to have Supreme Court justices removed so he could replace them with people from his own party for political purposes. He failed, but it still counts against him. His Mosquito fleet, which was a way of trying to save money on the military, was a terrible idea that did cost the United States during the War of 1812. And a lot of his policies helped lead to that war. So Harding does get the nod here. Poor Benjamin Harrison draws the bad luck of going up against George Washington. And Washington is who made the Washington made the Constitution work, and he's laid down power, something a lot of people don't do. He could have been a king if he wanted to. He could have been president for life, and he decided not to. That's a true sign of greatness. Um, the He declared neutrality, and being neutral in European wars served the United States very well. It wasn't until like World War II that the United States should have been going into wars in Europe. Before that, it was better to be neutral. Here, I'm going to go with McKinley. I do think Clinton's a good, solid president. I don't want people to think I'm just going against Clinton for political reasons. I'm being as unpolitical as I can. Part of the reason why we don't do Obama, Trump, and Biden, because it gets into political debates there. But McKinley won the Spanish-American War. He gained Hawaii for the United States. He fixed a really terrible economy that was left over from Grover Cleveland. And set the economy up to be pretty good for until the Great Depression happened. And there was a lot of changes within the economy from what he set up until by the time that happened. So he's a pretty solid president. Clinton was good economically too. I think McKinley was just a better foreign policy president than Clinton. That's where Clinton's weakness really was. Kennedy and Grover Cleveland, this is another slam dunk here. Kennedy did have a few miscues, but he rose to greatness at the most important time during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's generally looked down upon for his Vienna summit, but he basically, after the Vienna summit, was when the Soviets decided to build a Berlin Wall, which means they were not going to try to take over West Berlin. And part of the reason there, I do believe, was Kennedy saying we're not abandoning this place because they tried under Truman and under Eisenhower to take it. I think Kennedy was the one. They've probably figured, well, it's not going to happen. So the Berlin Wall was a bad thing for the people in Berlin, but it did show how terrible communism was that they basically had to imprison their people to keep them there. And Grover Cleveland was just awful. Bad on the economy, bad on human rights, and bad in foreign policy. So he's got the trifecta. And there's another slam dunk. This might be the furthest gap we've had so far in two presidents against one another. Truman was a great president. He outlined the Cold War. He restructured basically much of the government for the Cold War through the National Defense Act. Did not run surpluses, but he did get the deficits down quite a bit. Good for the economy. Johnson pretty much is the guy that made it so the Reconstruction failed. So Johnson sucks. So he was lucky to win it. Only because he got someone as bad as Van Buren did he win there anyway. Okay. I thought I did, but I didn't do it yet. Okay, Tyler and FDR. This is another one. FDR was great in his World War II leadership, but he does have some issues. He did not. He fell during the Great Depression to cure the Great Depression. It wasn't his policies. It was World War II that cured it. In fact, in 1941, U.S. unemployment was still above 10%. He tried his court packing scheme, which was a bad idea, and he actually was able to cajole justices into doing things that they were against before, basically by scaring them with that court packing scheme. Um, and you have the Japanese internment, and many New Deal laws were written so that they couldn't benefit African Americans, and he was against anti-lynching laws. He was against allowing Jewish people to immigrate from and get away from the Holocaust. In fact, he called them potential spies for the Nazi Germany. So he's great as a wartime president, but the other stuff he's kind of mediocre. Tyler's actually a pretty good president that's underrated. Next one, this is a very interesting pairing. It just happened this way. This is the first one I saw. I thought was super interesting. The father and son pairing of the two Adamses, and these are pairings in black are what were seeded out by the polls. But to me, if it was for their life as a whole, it would obviously be, and I misspelled, John Adams, but John Quincy was better as a president. Neither one were really all that great. But John Adams did have the Sedition Act that goes against him, and he did push for a war with France before he relented and kind of went away from that. Where John Quincy Adams really didn't do much, but he didn't do anything negative. His biggest failing was that he wouldn't remove people from office that were actively working against him. Taft and Lyndon Johnson. Taft was basically the president that everybody sort of thinks that Teddy Roosevelt was. The good stuff Roosevelt did, Taft kind of did the same types of things, and he did so in a constitutional manner. Lyndon Johnson, Vietnam War is probably one of the worst things any president did. He basically, because he didn't want to be seen as losing Vietnam, he kept people in a war that he knew he couldn't win. 50,000 American soldiers died in that war, not even counting all the issues with the Vietnamese people that died because of it. So that just him doing that war was enough to drop him below someone like Taft. Also, a lot of Great Society programs were counterproductive, so that counts against him. Calvin Coolidge was a solid president, but never near as good as Eisenhower. Eisenhower, 6 times during his term. 6 times during his term, his generals came to him unanimously wanting him to do a nuclear first strike or a nuclear strike to end a situation. First strike against Russia was one of them. Once they wanted to use it in Hungary in 1956 when they were grumbling to try to become free. During the U-2 incident, which would make no sense, was one of them. In Vietnam, in Korea, they asked him to use it a lot. He turned that down every single time. He didn't run a surplus, but he was as close as we've come to running an actual surplus during a president's term. Since Calvin Coolidge was the last president to run a surplus. But a lot of the stuff money was spent on under Eisenhower was there before he became president. So I think Eisenhower, he took the best parts of the New Deal and kind of kept them going, but kind of shut away some of the other ones. The only thing I'd say against Eisenhower was he probably should have lowered taxes more, but he didn't really see the economy working. But if you lower taxes, it increases the economic activity. But other than that, a really great president. So now we're going on to the next round, Lincoln versus Polk. Already discussed that Lincoln won the Civil War and freed the slaves. Polk actually, through the Mexican-American War, that was one of the major causes of the Civil War. And he was against the Wilmot Proviso, which would have outlawed slavery in the new territories taken from Mexico. He wanted to extend the Missouri Compromise line, which would have allowed for slavery in Southern California. Reagan and Ford's another one. Ford's a good, solid president, but Reagan's a great president. Like I said, Ford was the right man at the right time, but Reagan was really the right man at the right time. So this is a pretty easy win for Reagan. In fact, there's really no one in this one's side of his. If you look at the people in these brackets, so like Lincoln, Polk was probably the next best guy there, and Ford's probably the next best guy there. But there's really no one to compete with those guys in these brackets for these two. Like I said, Reagan, that's easy. Fillmore and Bush, I'm going with Bush here. I think the way he handled the end of the Cold War really pushes him forward. Really a top-notch foreign policy president. I think presidents a lot freer-handed foreign policy than domestic policy. He also did a lot of things like the Ryan White Act, which did a lot to help prevent AIDS. The Americans with Disabilities Act. He did get the economy going. It just didn't happen quick enough to help him get reelected. Plus, he's pretty humble, which kind of hurts. I think being a promoter, maybe not as much as Donald Trump is a self-promoter, but being a self-promoter really helps presidents. You look at guys that are humble, like Ford didn't get reelected, Bush didn't get reelected, Taft didn't get reelected. Grant Harding, this is actually of this round. This is the closest so far. Harding is good, but Grant really he did a lot of things to help the economy. He kept the country on the gold standard, didn't sign the Inflation Act. He really doesn't get a lot of credit for the things he did economically. And really wasn't getting credit for a long time for the stuff he did on human rights, but economic rights was really good too. And Harding was good there too, but I just think the Grant gets the edge of there. Washington McKinley once again. McKinley's good, but let's be honest, Washington's going to win that one. But I mean, McKinney's a lot closer to Washington than Polk is to Lincoln. McKinney and Truman are a pretty good matchup there too. But Washington wins. Kennedy was good, but not as good as Truman. I think you just got to give. I mean, Truman was not a guy that the public liked at the time. The historians always liked him, so he was always ranked high in the historical rankings. But you got to give the due to Truman there. Kennedy was good. Truman was greater than their grade, so Truman wins that one. But this is a much closer bracket here than this one over here was. This one here was kind of close too, I think. But it should be because you got the number 4 guy here. You got the number 1 guy there. Next one, Tyler, John Quincy Adams. I mean, John Quincy Adams is in that position pretty much as a by default. I mean, he was John Adams. I love John Adams as a founding father, but he was a mediocre president. John Quincy Adams is a mediocre president too, but he was a little bit better than his father. Tyler, I put in the top 15, so Tyler's going to win that one pretty easily there. He had, to me, honestly, I think that's his easiest win so far. Roosevelt was definitely way better than John Quincy Adams. Next one, Eisenhower and Taft. Because Taft was a good, solid president. Eisenhower was a great president. So Eisenhower actually probably had one of the tougher runs to get here because Taft is decent, Coolidge is good. Grant the hardest run to beat Madison and then beat Harding. That'd be my thing, I'd say. Lincoln had an easy shot, but that's Lincoln. Reagan had an easy shot. Bush and Fillmore, I think Bush is pretty much easy, but Grant had to beat a really good Madison. Well, I put them guys side by side in my personal rankings, and he had to beat Harding, who was not too far behind him. McKinley's good, but I mean, we're talking Washington here. Harrison's not as good as some of those other guys. Truman had a slightly hard one because Kennedy's a fairly good president, top 15 once again. Tyler had an easy walk in there pretty much. I guess Eisenhower didn't have one of the easier ones, but we're down to our final 8. And these are not my top 8 presidents, I'll tell you that right now, but many of them are. And my personal top 4 is all still here right now. Actually, my personal top 6 are all here right now. So there's 2 that aren't, and Tyler's one of them. Tyler and Bush, I wouldn't put in the top 6, but the others I would. This is a close one, because Reagan did defeat the Soviet Union, but I just have to give that edge to Lincoln. But this is going to be the closest of this group of right here that's left so far. Got to go with Lincoln. In this group here, Reagan would win. If you had Reagan and Bush switched, but otherwise he wouldn't. Here you're going with Grant. I just think that what Grant did to help the economy, he was very solid in foreign policy. Foreign policy wasn't as big back then, but he did get a arbitration treaty with Great Britain, which settled the Alabama claims. And he also settled the Virginia's dispute with Spain. Both very well. I think he deserves credit for that. As good as Truman is, you got George Washington sitting right there. Washington, like I said, he made the Constitution work. Hard to go against Washington. Then here on the bottom, like I said, Tyler kind of got where he was partially by weaker competition. He had the luckiest draw of those 8 people, honestly. Then it maybe would have been Reagan. Yeah, because he had to fight Ted Coolidge here. So I'd say luckiest draw of the 8 was Tyler. Maybe Bush. Bush was probably the second luckiest because he only. I mean, Monroe's tough though. Monroe should have went further. So should have Madison. Those guys are both good presidents. They got tough draws. So we got Washington, Eisenhower, Lincoln, and Grant. These are 3 of my top 4 presidents right here. So kind of falling out the way it should fall out when you look at it in that manner. It's that Eisenhower to me is the closest president to what George Washington was. Both of them had relatively mistake-free times in office, and both served during very dangerous times. The beginning of the nuclear age for Eisenhower, the Soviet Union started being a nuclear threat. Washington at the founding of, not really the founding, but the recreating of the government under the Constitution. But those times were much more dangerous, and they did such a good job in those 2 times. I think those are 2 of the most dangerous times in the history of the country. They both excelled. Lincoln was going to win here too. Although it is interesting, his general is the guy he beats to get to the final. That was probably the 3rd time that was really super dangerous. I mean, the Civil War could have been lost. People say it wasn't inevitable that the North would win. And if you actually look at the history, I mean, even at Gettysburg, there's spots where Lee could have broke through, and I think Lincoln really did a good job to hold the country together. Because even a lot of people in the North were of the mind of said, just let him go. Who cares? So he held the country together. If he doesn't hold the country together, is what is left of the United States. Every time a state was mad, they could just secede at any time they wanted if he didn't force them to stay in. And government of the people, which is what it was. If you're represented in the government, you have to accept the results, even if they don't go your way. And what the South was doing is they weren't accepting results of an election because they didn't like it. That's why they seceded from the Union. So we have Washington versus Lincoln. These guys are usually the top 2 presidents in most rankings. In fact, you can see there are 1 and 2. 2 of my top presidents. But I do go with Washington here. I just don't think the United States would have even lasted had Washington not done what he did. You can nitpick Lincoln a little bit for a few decisions, like the way he handled habeas corpus and whatnot, and how long it did take to win the Civil War. But to me, I don't think. If you really have to try to nitpick Washington, I have seen some people that they will make some complaints like the Whiskey Rebellion, but if you actually look into the Whiskey Rebellion, it's pretty easy to destroy any argument against the way Washington handled that. Plus, a lot of people don't like the First Bank of the United States of America. But if you look at the results of that, it got the economy going. It gave the country a solid footing. So my winner of the, we'll call it the March Madness President's Bracket is George Washington defeats Abraham Lincoln in the final. Well, I should have put that on here, but I didn't. March Madness. (2022) March Madness Presidents 2022. There's your winner, George Washington. Of course, I knew he was going to win because I have him ranked first. But a lot of people would pick Lincoln there. A lot of picks I made, I know a lot of people would not make. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, comment, and have a great day.